QSO Today, episode 310, Al Brogdon, W1AB. This episode of QSO Today is sponsored by ICOM America, makers of the finest HF, VHF, and UHF transceivers and accessories for the radio amateur, reminding you to check out their new IC705 all-band portable transceiver. More on this later. And by QRP Labs, makers of the popular QCX kit transceiver and a whole host of parts and kits for the ham radio builder. My thanks to both ICOM America, who, by the way, is the platinum sponsor of the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, and QRP Labs for sponsoring the QSO Today podcast. This week at the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo, we have added a prize section to our website. Our sponsors and exhibitors are donating prizes that will be won by hams that spend the most time in the convention visiting sponsors and exhibitors, participating in the chat conversations, and watching the speaker presentations, accumulating points on our leaderboard. If you have not yet signed up for your free ticket to the expo, please click on the link in this week's show notes page and go to the expo website. We are beginning to feel that we are so much closer to this event. All of us who are working on this event to make it a success look forward to seeing you there. Welcome to the QSO Today podcast. I'm Eric Guth for W1UG, your host. My QSO today is with Al Brogdon, W1AB, who was licensed almost 70 years ago and has made significant contributions to our hobby through his writing for QST magazine over the years, including 100, 50, and 25 years ago column, and articles for both 73 and ham radio magazines. I know that you'll enjoy this QSO with W1AB. W1AB, this is Eric for W1UG. Are you there, Al?
Yes, Eric, this is W1AB right here.
Al, thanks for joining me on the QSO Today podcast. Can we start at the beginning of your ham radio story? When and how did it start for you?
Oh, man, that goes back a long way. I became interested in radio at an early age, and by the time I was in high school, I was fiddling around with electrical experiments, building my first crystal radio set and all that. And when I was 15 years old, the novice license was announced. And so when I was 15, I took my novice exam, and then my first novice license was issued on January 15th, 1952.
Now, was it unusual in those days? As you say, it seemed like it was natural that the novice license should have been something that was part of ham radio all along. Why do you suppose that was? Did something change after World War II that caused perhaps the amateur radio organizations like the ARRL or even the FCC to consider a novice license?
I am supposing that everyone realized that the ham population at that time was getting older, and they needed to expand the ham population and also bring in more young people. And I think that's what did it. So on July the 1st, 1951, the novice license was introduced. So I was one of the early ones, but not the earliest.
Now, did you have any Elmers or mentors that helped you along at that point, or did you do this on your own?
I had no Elmers. I did it the brute force way. What had started me getting interested in ham radio is that my dad had an old-fashioned table radio that covered the shortwave bands, and as a matter of fact, there was a narrow piece of adhesive tape on the dial, and I asked him one day, what's that piece of tape on the dial? And he said, that's where we used to listen to Prime Minister Winston Churchill's speeches live during World War II. So anyway, the radio covered several ham bands, and I started listening to hams. I'd listened to the, back then, AM phone hams, and then I also could copy code even without a BFO by the rushing noise it made. So the only help I had is that one of my friends who lived in a town 10 miles away was studying at the same time, and he and I would sometimes get together and send CW back and forth. Except for that, I had no element.
Do you remember any electronic books or electrical books that really might have helped you along with your interest in those days?
Not really. I read about radio with books that I checked out of the high school library, and I learned a little about the history of radio. Now, consider, Eric, that at that time, radio was only a little bit more than 50 years old. So I got in when it was still in its early developmental stages. I did get a copy of the ARRL's license. That's what I studied.
Do you remember your first rig?
Oh, my, yes. Don Mix, W1TS, was a very famous ham at that time, and he was on the staff of ARRL. And he wrote an article in QST about building a crystal oscillator transmitter. It was a single 6AG7 that was pi coupled to the antenna. It ran maybe about 5 or 6 watts on a good day. And back in those days, you could buy QST on the newsstand, and I bought a couple of copies of QST along the way. And I found a radio store in New York State called Niagara Radio Supply that had a kit for that transmitter. Now, this was in the days when things were built on breadboards using little pieces of wood screwed together. So I ordered that kit, and when it came, it had everything I needed, including the little pieces of wood pre-cut to the size I needed, solder, and everything else. All I needed was a soldering iron and a couple of hand tools to put it together.
And that's what you did?
And that's what I did.
What was the receiver that you used with that rig?
My parents very nicely bought me a Hallicrafters S38B, and it was just the very basic of receivers, an AC-DC circuit for the old-timers who remember that. And it was pretty good on 80 and 40, and by the time you got up to 20 meters, it was not very sensitive, but boy, it worked, and I used it for many years.
And when did you upgrade?
Let's see. I got the novice in January of 52, and then I got my general about 6 months later. And then I think it was about, I don't remember the year, but it was about 1965 that I got my extra class license. And it's very interesting because that's still in the early days of solid state technology. Bell Labs had announced the invention of the transistor only in 1948. So by the time I took my exam for the extra class license, I learned that the FCC had only one question in their list of questions that had to do with solid state devices. And the FCC put that one question on every extra class test. So it was sort of a freebie.
Did ham radio play a part in the choices that you made for your education and career?
Well, yes, it led on to my getting a degree in electrical engineering, and I pursued that for about 12 years. And my dad was a reporter for a newspaper and a writer, so I grew up in an atmosphere of proper language usage. Well, as an engineer, every time I would be working with other engineers on a project, they learned to say, okay, Al, you write the report since you can write. And so at one point, the job I was working on for a defense contractor at that time ended, and I had to look for a new job within the company. Well, it so happened that an opening was available at the same salary for a technical writer. So I tried that, and I liked it, and I stayed in technical writing and technical editing for the rest of my career.
You got a BSCE?
Yes, got a BS in electrical engineering.
From where?
From Tennessee Tech. At the time I went, it was a small college. I remember the school newspaper in its first fall edition, my sophomore year, had a big headline on the front page that says, on-campus enrollment has reached 2,000. And nowadays, Tennessee Tech is a large university, and I'm very pleased to see it have succeeded.
Just for the listeners that may be looking for work, technical writing is still a huge field. I know that English speakers in Israel oftentimes will find themselves technical writing just because having a command of the English language is really important.
Indeed, it is important. And one of the women I worked with at a defense contractor in Maryland that I worked at found an interesting job. She went to Quebec City and worked as a technical editor for the papers that the doctors were writing in English. And a lot of them, French was their first language, English was their second. So she did very well in helping them become published.
Well, it always surprises me. I think that technical writing will be one of those professions that will never die because being able to communicate effectively a technical product to the user or even to the people that service it is so important.
And the background I had held me in good stead because a lot of technical writers and technical editors don't have so much of a technical background. One time when I was editing a test plan for an enormous shipborne receiving system that would cover, as the saying goes, DC to light. They went from ultra-low frequencies up to super high frequency. And so the purpose of this test plan that I was editing was it had to prove all the technical specifications that the contract called for. Well, I got to this one and I read it and I thought, that doesn't sound right. So I read it again carefully and I went to the chief engineer on that project and I said, Tom, this is not going to prove the technical spec. This is going to prove something else, but not the technical spec. And he read it and he thought about it and he looked at me and he said, how did you know that? And I said, easy, I'm an electrical engineer.
What's the current rig? I should state that I already know that you're kind of in transit right now between getting yourself set up again. But what would be the current rig if you were all set up?
Well, down in the basement, I have what was the best station I've ever had. It's a Tintec Omni 6 and the matching Tintec kilowatt amplifier. But right now, I have a very small rig here in my den with my computer and my stereo system and all that. And it's a TS-50, a good old Kenwood TS-50 that I used as a mobile rig. My wife and I, after we retired, we owned a small motorhome and took off on a 7-month tour of the United States. We went all over the United States, and I had that TS-50 as a mobile rig. And I worked all CW. I very seldom work phone. I'm left-handed, which is a great advantage because I built myself a little armrest that tucked into the window slot in the left door. And then I had my keying paddle, which was a good old Ultronic paddle from the 1970s. And so I could just lay my arm up there and my left hand was in perfect position to key. So I could drive with my right hand and key with my left hand, and it worked out very well.
And do you find that when you're operating CW that it's just like someone talking to you? Do you have the ability to, obviously you do, concentrate on the road and have the conversation at the same time?
Yes. Now, the concept I have that I've never really seen promoted is that to be a really good CW operator, you need to be fluent in CW. Fluent meaning you need to listen to the dots and dashes, and without thinking, you're understanding what is being said. So that is the way I became to operate mobile. And so I can go along and talk with somebody on the radio when I'm driving, just like turning to my right and talking in the English language with my wife.
And now this message from ICOM America. Get out and be active with ICOM's new IC705 and its optional multifunction backpack. The ICOM IC705 is your perfect QRP companion as it has many of the same base station features and functionality of ICOM's bigger rigs. At the tip of your fingers in a portable package covering HF 6 meters, 2 meters, and 70 centimeters. This compact rig weighs in at 1 kilo or just over 2 pounds, with RF direct sampling for most of the HF band and IF sampling for frequencies above 25 megahertz. The ICOM IC705 has a large 4.3-inch color touchscreen with live band scope and waterfall, similar to the IC7300. I can't wait to get my IC705 to use as a baseband rig for satellites and microwave projects, including the S-HALE geosynchronous satellite. The ICOM IC705 puts out 5 watts with its BP272 battery pack and a full 10 watts when connected to an external 13.8-volt power supply. The rig does single sideband, CW, AM, FM, as well as full D-Star functions. Other features include micro USB connector, Bluetooth and wireless LAN over Wi-Fi, integrated GPS with antenna and GPS logger, a micro SD card slot, and the HM243 speaker microphone is standard equipment. As this is the perfect QRP or QRPP rig, the perfect accessory for the IC705 is the optional LC192 backpack with its special compartment for the IC705 and room for accessories for soda activations or just a day social distancing in the park. For more information on this fabulous new rig, click on the banner in this week's show notes. And when you go to buy your new ICOM IC705, be sure to tell your dealer that you heard about it here on QSO Today. My thanks to ICOM America for sponsorship of the QSO Today podcast. Now, there's a lot of people that listen to the QSO Today podcast who would like to improve their CW skills. Obviously, for some reason, when you're doing a podcast of old-timers, a lot of them are CW operators. Is there like a whole word concept with CW? I mean, do you hear whole words or do you hear letters?
No, I don't really hear letters. I hear words, and when we get to the higher speeds, I start to hear phrases. Now, this is interesting. The highest speed I have qualified for copying code is 40 words a minute, but I can head copy. That is, listen and understand perfectly what is being said. I can head copy. I used to be able to head copy at 55 words a minute. Well, at the present time, I'm embarrassed to admit that I have been inactive for a couple of years. So I went to the Google Play Store and I found a really nice app that I downloaded on my phone. And you can type in or cut and paste text, and then it will send it in CW, in Morse. So I found out that even after being inactive for a couple of years, I can still head copy about 40 words a minute. So I'm doing okay for a guy 84 years old, I reckon.
I think I have an app on my iPhone that you can get it to play like the UPI News at various speeds. So the source of the CW is one of the news feeds. Well, that's very cool. Do you remember what the name of the app is that you're using?
Let me take a quick and figure it out. But I didn't know about that news app. That is grand.
What I'll do is I'll share that in the show notes.
Okay, that's great. I'd take that. Okay, this app I have is Morse Player Free, and it really works well. And here's an interesting bit of history that I think a lot of your older viewers will remember, and a lot of the younger viewers will not know about. There is an American Morse code, which was used by the landline telegraph operators of the Railroad, Western Union, and those wire services. And the American Morse code is a little bit different than our international Morse code. Well, I remember back in the mid-1960s, there were a lot of the tired landline telegraph operators who would chat, usually on the low end of 80 meters, using American Morse code. And I could listen to them, and I could copy what they were saying, except that there were, I don't know how many, about 8 characters that are different. And it was fun. And then I learned that these operators, these old landline Morse operators, would hook up the senders like the telegraph operators used. And instead of listening to audio, they would listen to this thing go clonk up and down. And I just admired that so much, and I thought it was so much fun that they did that.
You might be surprised to know that there's actually a group of people around the world that are using those American Morse code senders and receivers, those little electromagnetic clappers or tickers, right, for receiving. And what they've done is they've actually connected those to the serial port on their computers so that there's actually like an on-the-air or on-the-internet chat where this is all going. I think I can find a website and put that on the show notes page of groups of people that they're not necessarily hams who are doing it, but people who are communicating using this old gear, but using the international as the wire between all of these devices.
Well, thank you. I appreciate hearing about that because it's nice to hear the old American Morse is still going on. So if you can give me a link, that would be delightful.
I'll put that link in the show notes page. I saw it someplace because I actually got a grandson who, for whatever reason, at some point when I write my autobiography, I'll talk about my unusual grandchildren, but they don't have any connection at all to any radio or media or anything like that. So I actually had thought to actually create something like this for him so that I could teach him the Morse code and communicate with him without threatening the parents with putting a radio in the house. That's an interesting idea. And what's interesting is that there are still people out there who really get a kick out of doing it this way.
I admire people like that. It's the same people that keep old cars going and get them in a condition that looks like they just drove off the showroom floor. It's a very nice tip of the hat to the old times.
I think what's cool about it is maybe it maintains buggy whip makers to create an image, but I think it's kind of cool that it's possible to maintain these skills that are 200 years old at this point.
I agree wholeheartedly, and I appreciate you providing me with some more information about that.
Now, one of the things that you sent me at the beginning of our conversation was that you actually have been writing for QST Magazine for many years. How did it start that you started being a writer for QST Magazine?
I believe the first article I wrote for them was how to modify the Viking Adventurer to work on 6 meters. This was back in the mid-50s when I was in college, and 6 meters was pretty hot. And so I went in there and did very little modification and got it to work on 6 meters. I was doubling in the final amplifier, so probably my output was something in the range of 10 watts, but on 6 meters, that and the 4-element beam I built was enough. So I wrote that for QST, and then a few months after that, I had worked up an antenna tuner that had switch selectable 5 different circuits. So I wrote an article called the 5-way antenna coupler, and it was published in QST, and I was really pleased that the next year they picked that to go in the ARRL handbook.
And so what happened after that? It seems to me that you've been kind of a prolific writer all of that time, or almost all of your ham radio career, isn't that right?
I have done a fair amount of writing, just sort of here and there over the years, not continually. And I would have to characterize my writing as some being technical writing, some being humorous writing. For example, in the 1960s, of course, this was before cell phones. I know some of your viewers may not remember that there was an era when we did not have cell phones. But I was living in State College, Pennsylvania at the time, and our radio club at the company I worked for was very active, and a lot of us were on good old 6-meter AM. So one election year, we got together and did a very nice public service bit where we invited people who needed a ride to the polls to call one of the hams. And then he would call on 6 meters to one of us who was out in our car to go to such and such address and pick up a voter to go to the polls. So I wrote an article about that, and it was published in QST. That was a nice public service to do back in those days.
Did you write for any other magazines besides QST? There was the Ham Radio magazine. I remember that one. CQ has obviously been around a long time, 73.
Oh, yeah. I wrote quite a bit for CQ as well, and I wrote for Ham Radio. and I wrote for 73. And it was very interesting because this was back about 1961 or 2. I had articles into the three magazines, QST, CQ, and 73, and the schedule was that they would all three be published the same month. And I was getting a big chuckle out of that. As it turns out, one of the magazines had some slippage, and they put mine off to the next year, so I didn't make the 3 in 1 month.
Were you a subscriber to all those magazines in those days?
Oh, yes, and I kept them. I had tons of radio magazines back in those days. And I had been a member of the league since 1953. So I had all the magazines since 1953. And in addition to that, there was a ham in Illinois who advertised in the ham ads that he bought and sold old QSTs. And he was a really nice guy. I'm sorry I can't remember his call sign, but I wrote him and told him where my continuous run of QSTs began and said I would like to start extending the library earlier in time. And we had a great arrangement. He would send me 1 or 2 years at a time, usually every month, and then along with the 2, he would ship them and send a bill, and then I would send him a check in return. And so I finally had QSTs that went back to about, I think it was 1923 to the then present, continuous and all in good condition. And it finally got to be so much that when I moved from Pennsylvania to Maryland in 1970, I sold the entire collection and haven't collected them since.
Now, one of the ways that I find speakers or guests for the QSO Today podcast is I actually go through the magazines looking for writers. And I think that I discovered you because you wrote a history of amateur radio during World War I. Do you recall that?
Oh, yes. That was fun. As you have noted, I write the 150 and 25 years ago column for QST, and I've been writing it for just a bit over 20 years. So when it came around to the earliest years of radio, the editor of QST asked me to write that. And so I dug around in the old QSTs and put the story together. And what was interesting is that the reporting in those early QSTs was sometimes not complete. So the article was not quite as complete as I would have liked, but nevertheless, it gave all the readers a look at that early radio.
Now, do you find it's difficult to find primary source material for researching that period of time? Ham radio in that period of time, was QST the only resource then?
It was just about the only resource. I used my favorite search engine, Google, to look on the web, and there's a little bit that some of the old timers put up, but very little. And QST then was the main source.
Hey, this is Eric for just another short break. One of my favorite ham radio podcasts is the Ham Radio Workbench podcast, hosted by George, KJ6VU, my guest in episode 232, and Jeremy, KF7IJZ. George and Jeremy take a bi-weekly deep dive into their favorite ham radio workbench projects and the technologies that fascinate them. If you want to be a ham radio builder or just be inspired, click on the link in this week's show notes page.
Now, you mentioned that you've written for all the magazines, Ham Radio Magazine, CQ, and 73. Now, I remember that 73 seemed to emphasize, at least maybe in the 70s when I got started, 73 seemed to emphasize FM and repeaters more than perhaps the other magazines did. What was the secret sauce that maybe made Ham Radio Magazine different from CQ and 73? Do you recall what the differences were and what the flavors were at the time?
Well, Wayne Green is an interesting guy.
He was the editor of 73.
Yeah, the editor of 73, the publisher. I got to meet him one time after I graduated college. I went on active duty with the Army and ended up in Germany. At the time, Wayne came to Germany on a tour, and I got to meet him and have lunch with him one day. And I think the success of 73 was, yes, as you pointed out, they got on to the Peters bandwagon a little bit earlier than CQ or QST. And Wayne always had sort of the rebel attitude, which a lot of people like. And he had a lot more really down-to-earth articles for the common ham who was perhaps not so technically sophisticated and just wanted to build some little projects that would make his ham operation better. So I think that's mainly what it was.
So 73 had more hands-on. That's kind of how I remembered as well. What was there about Ham Radio Magazine then? What do you suppose made Ham Radio Magazine different than, say, QST?
Well, Ham Radio was a little bit more oriented toward the forefront of technology, and they were getting things before the other magazines were, technically.
So they might have been into slow scan TV, for example.
Indeed.
Before the other magazines got there.
Yes.
Do you remember when you wrote that article about the history of ham radio during World War I? Was there something unique about that? Obviously, it was a world war, but something unique about that period of time that was mentioned in your article? Because I think during that time and just after the war, there was also the Spanish flu pandemic. Is there any parallels between that period of time and now?
Well, not so much, but what was really interesting about that era is this. So people started experimenting with radio, and in the earliest part of radio, hams would get on the air without call signs. It was not regulated, and they would just get on the air and make up their own call sign, which might be their initials or something like that. So the primary users of radio at that point were the U.S. Navy, simply because they discovered that's a way we can talk between land stations and our ships at sea and among the ships at sea. So, and that was in the day when it was spark transmission, where spark transmission was just a generation of wideband static type noise. And there would be different tones to it depending on how the station was set up, but everybody was at the same place on the dial. So we have the Navy doing important work for sure, and we have the hams. Well, as you would expect, hams were experimenting and improving their equipment steadily, while the Navy, and this is typical for the military even today, the military was having trouble keeping up with the latest developments. So the hams would have better stations, they would have stronger signals, and they could talk to each other, talk to one another through all this mutual interference a lot better than the Navy stations could. So pretty soon, the U.S. Navy started making noises. They wanted to shut down ham radio, period, entirely, period. And there were two times which they tried to do that. One was before World War, and the other was after World War. And the American Radio Relay League, to its great credit, took up the battle, and they started going to Washington and telling congressmen and senators what this radio stuff was all about. They got support, and it was only through the League's effort that ham radio didn't get shut down entirely. If it had, I suppose it would have come back in a later era, but it would have not been what it is now.
What were the frequency bands that were popular in those days? Obviously, there's a misconception that perhaps higher frequencies just didn't work, and I think the hams certainly were the pioneers that brought the rest of the world into higher frequencies. But what were the frequencies in those days that hams in the Navy operated on?
You are exactly right. Well, at first, as I said, it was just broadband static, and everybody's working there. And then the Federal Radio Commission, predecessor to the FCC, assigned hams to these higher frequencies. to these shorter wavelengths to get them out of everybody's way. Everybody knows they aren't any good. And so the hams showed that the higher bands work fine. And there was a lot of work, first on 160 meters, and then hams started experimenting, and ham bands by this time had been assigned. So after showing that 160 meters would work just fine, hams went up to 80 meters and found that it worked fine, and in some cases even better. And so just step by step, band by band, the hams led the way to the higher frequencies. And the same was true when it came to getting out of the HF range and into VHF, UHF, and up. Hams for a long time led the way. I remember, and this would have been in the 1960s, when the two hams, one in Hawaii and one in California, were very famous in doing pioneering UHF and VHF contacts, setting new distance records for hams. And they did very good work. They were cutting edge technology. They were doing something that the commercial interests weren't doing. And they came to the interest of the Air Force. So the Air Force learned technology from these two hams.
I'm curious, what did the spectrum allocation chart look like in the 1920s? Did the hams already have ham radio frequencies up into VHF and UHF? I mean, was that even something that was on the radar, to make a pun here, on the radar of the Federal Radio Commission in those days?
To tell the truth, I'm not sure when these band allocations occurred, but it was something about them. But there were some band allocations made in pretty high frequencies. And I'll tell you something, as the compiler of the old information in QST column, I ran across this a few years ago, and it just tickled me to death. Back in the 1950s, I remember people had these little space heaters that were parabolic reflectors with a screw-in thing that went into a light bulb socket, and then it had resistant wire wound around a ceramic form.
Right, I remember those.
You remember those, okay. And a lot of the people watching the cast here will remember those. Well, I learned that at ARL Lab, they calculated the frequency at which those parabolic reflectors could be used, and they asked the Federal Radio Commission for a band at that frequency and got it. And of course, it was just absurdly high. Nobody could ever go that high. It took them many years to get that high, but I thought it was so funny that it was based on the old electric heat.
I remember in the late 70s, I think I said this on an earlier show, and I beg the forgiveness of the listeners if I sound like I'm repeating myself. But I remember when Orange County Communications, which was the public service radio in Orange County, California, had bought their first 800 megahertz repeater, and we were all wondering whether or not the thing would actually work, that you could actually talk any distance on 800 megahertz. It seems to me that in every generation, I think now we're looking at 100 gigahertz. Can we communicate on 100 gigahertz? And I think we're going to find that we probably can as well. It's always interesting to me that when we push that upper limit, that it also works.
Indeed. And that's the way it has been, and that's the way the frequency extensions have continued up into the higher regions. And it's been fascinating. So when I got my license, man, 2 meters, that is way up there. And you might remember that novices had a 2-meter phone subband that they could operate. I don't think a lot of novices got on that band, but it was there.
They would operate that Heathkit lunchbox or the Goonie Birds, right? The public defense radios.
Well, that came just a little bit later, but Heathkit came out with these 2er and 6er, which were little boxes that had a super regenerative receiver in them and a low-power transmitter. And they were enough, to work across town. So a lot of hams and a lot of novices to get on 2 meters.
Now, you had mentioned to me in a message that you sent to me that you've done a lot of mobile operating, and at the beginning of the show you talked about how you put the keyer paddle on your left hand, in the door of your vehicle. But you've done a lot of mobile operating in other vehicles. What's the most unusual vehicle that you've done mobile operating in?
Well, the one that sometimes blows people's mind is that I've also been a motorcycle rider now for 52 years. I started that in the 1960s, and it was back in 1992. My wife is listening and calling in the answers. See, I'm 84 years old. I'm forgetful, so she's a big help to me. So in 1992, I bought a Honda Goldwing motorcycle, and I traded in the cycle I had for the Goldwing because I found it at the end of the season for a really good price. I bought it with the express purpose of riding it to Alaska because I had read that a bunch of Alaska motorcycle clubs went together to have a rally. And when you rode and stopped at these various checkpoints in the towns along the Alaska Highway, once you went through all of them and rode the entire Alaska Highway, you could get a nice little lapel pin, a nice little award. So I bought the Goldwing, and of course the next thing is, well, why don't we put a ham rig on it? And at the time I had a Kenwood, what was it, a TS450 or something like that, which was one of the medium-sized ham rigs. And I built a mount to put that over the handlebars. So, and then I had a trailer hitch on the back of the motorcycle and used that to mount standard mobile antennas. Well, okay, now how are we going to key? Again, I'm left-handed, and that is a great help because the left hand on a motorcycle, all it has to do is pull in the lever to pull in the clutch. So I made a small bracket and attached it just behind the handlebar grip, 2 micro switches back to back. So when I put my hand palm down on the handlebar, my forefinger and thumb reach the 2 micro switches. And of course, I'm using electronic keyer, so I'm doing series of dots and dashes. And I could just, send CW fine. And although I can copy fairly fast, I never have been a smith. I've usually operated at speeds like 20 or 25 words a minute. And I could send 25 words a minute. And so as we're going along, I would tell people I was motorcycle mobile. And there were 3 consistent replies I would get from almost everybody. One of the 3. One reply was, "Did you say you're on a motorcycle?" And the second one was, "Okay, on being on a motorcycle, you aren't moving, are you?" And the other was total, complete acceptance immediately. And they would say, "Okay, on the motorcycle, where's your keying pedal? Where's your rig? Where's your antenna?" And as I was driving to Alaska, when I got above a certain latitude, I stopped hearing signals from the lower 48 states very much and started hearing over-the-pole signal. So I was talking with Russian hams in Siberia, northern Scandinavia, and northern Japan. So there was this one Japanese called me one time, and he accepted it right away and started asking all these. And it turned out he had a motorcycle and started figuring out, wondering if he could do it. So that was fun. And another thing that happened on this trip to Alaska is that I made contact with another ham who had a Honda Goldwing, and he had a rig on it. And we made a motorcycle mobile to motorcycle mobile contact. And I think that's pretty rare, and it may have been the only one.
And now this message from QRP Labs. QRP Labs has shipped thousands of QCX QRP transceivers kits to date. The odds of working another QCX user gets better every day. If you're looking for a satisfying kit experience where you end up with an amazing performing QRP transceiver for under $50, let me say that again, for under $50, then you owe it to yourself to go to QRP Labs. We have many home brewers who listen to the QSO Today podcast. For you, QRP Labs also has parts, filters, enclosures, and other handy devices to make your home brewing experience even better. You can use these parts to either enhance your QRP Labs kits or to beef up your own homebrew designs. Be sure to browse Hand's entire website. Use the link on this week's show notes page or the one in the sponsored section of the QSO Today website to get to QRP Labs to buy your QCX or any of the other fine QRP Labs kits or parts. QRP Labs is my go-to ham radio kit company. It should be yours too. QRP Labs. And now back to our QSO Today. Now, does a guy that drives a Honda Goldwing motorcycle, does he pay attention to like a book like Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance? I mean, having read that book, it seemed like taking a cross-country trip on a motorcycle is a huge undertaking anyway. But is it less of an undertaking when you're on a Goldwing?
Well, I know the book. I've read it. It's a great book. And back in those days, it was an undertaking. Motorcycles were far less reliable than they are today. But I took off for Alaska with my 15-year-old son on the back seat, pulling a camping trailer, which opened up and made a tent camper. Okay, I am one of these guys who just does stuff. So I left on this 10,500-mile round trip to Alaska, having never taken a long trip on a motorcycle, having never done an overnight trip on a motorcycle. And I hate to quote somebody's trademark trade name, but I just did it.
We're heading off the realm of ham radio for a minute, but I think the listeners will forgive us. Anybody that's raised kids, especially teenagers, 15 years of age is kind of a difficult time for a lot of teenagers. How was that trip with your 15-year-old? Was that a life-changing event for you?
It's interesting you could ask. As a 15-year-old, our son Pat, who has grown into a wonderful adult. I'm very proud of him and the way he treats other people, and I'm proud of his accomplishment. But when he was 15 years old, he was in that period of difficulty. Some days he would be a very fine companion, and other times he would be difficult. But we made it. Now, he didn't especially want to go on the trip. I really wanted him to go. So he went, and years later, after talking with other people his age, when he was in his 20s, he all of a sudden realized how rich his life's experiences were because of what my wife Maggie and I did with it. And he really appreciates it. He had, the moment of enlightenment when he found out, oh my, I have done so much more than a lot of people my age. So it worked out, not without its difficulties, but it worked out, and he and I are the better for it.
Well, it seems to me that you could also write a book similar to Zen and the Art of Motorcycle Maintenance. As I recall, he also took his son on the back of his motorcycle.
Yes, and because I write, and because I have had so many really unique life adventures, my older kids, I have 4 kids, and so my kids, all grown adults now, and a lot of friends have said I should write a book about my life's adventure. And I have always thought, oh, maybe, but I'm sort of a lazy person. As it so happened, just about weeks ago, I started making some bullet items that will become an outline. I don't know if I'll ever write the book or not. I might not.
Well, when you do, you'll let me know, and I'll put it on the show notes page here so that people can find it. Do you de-expedition, or did you de-expedition?
I have done several de-expeditions, but the most successful one was I worked for a defense contractor back in the 1960s, and Now, remember that I had just spent a year in Germany on active duty with the Army. So they wanted me to go back to Germany as an engineer on a contract where they are supporting the Army. And as a matter of fact, it was elements of the old Army Security Agency, which no longer exists, eventually rolled into military intelligence. So I went back and I was operating with the German license. I had the call sign J0HZ. So I decided I was going to do a de-expedition and go down to the little country of San Marino, which is inside Italy near the coastal city of Rimini. So I went down there and I enlisted the help. Let me back up here. I was living in Frankfurt at the time, and I enlisted the services of an interpreter to transcribe a letter for me in Italian to write to the Italian Post, Telephone, and Telegraph, because San Marino, although it is an independent country, it will use Italian services and therefore fall under their jurisdiction. So I had to write Italy to get permission to operate in San Marino. So I went down there, packed a station and a complete set of equipment, spare equipment, antennas, everything I thought I would need into my Volkswagen bus and drove it down to San Marino. So then came the 1964 CW CQ Worldwide DX test, and I got on the air from San Marino. Well, the obvious value is this. Scoring is determined by how many stations you work for the points and how many countries you work as a multiplier to calculate the final score. So I was the only station in San Marino for the contest, and literally the world beat a path to my door. So I was working stations one after the other as fast as I could and sleeping as little as I could. I remember I would doze off in the middle of a contact and wake up and be confused for a minute until I figure out where I was. So I went down there and I had a 20-meter ground plane. I had an 80-meter dipole and I had a 40-meter dipole that I used on 40 and on 15 meter in the 3/2 wave mode. My transmitter ran perhaps 40 watts output. Well, that's not much against these super powerhouses you find on the air during the DX contest. But the magic of the call sign, Mike 1 Mike or Mickey 1 Mouse, just brought them in by the droves. And I found that I would have short skip up into Europe from Italy and long skip into the U.S. so I could be working both Europeans and Americans at the same time. And I ended up, even with that puny little station, having the 11th highest single operator score in the world for that contest. My best contest effort ever.
What most excites you about what's happening in amateur radio now?
Well, it excites me that they're still coming up with new modes to try, new techniques to try, and it's not like the old days where ham radio sort of led technology. Technology is pushed so much by the commercial and military interests that hams are just sort of keeping up. Yet, there's all kinds of new stuff going on, and for the dinosaurs like me, I can still get on 40 CW and have a good ride.
Something that you said at the very beginning when you got your novice license is that the novice license was created to attract younger people into a demographic that was getting old. What's interesting is that this is the same conversation we're still having 70 years later. What do you think about that? Do you think that we are replacing our numbers and we just do it differently and we just like to complain in every generation that we're losing numbers?
Well, there was a period of great expansion following the novice license, and that went on for many years, but it slowed down. And nowadays, the number of hams in the U.S. and in the world is remaining about the same or making slight gains, but we are indeed still doing pretty well for a bunch of hams.
Yeah, it certainly seems that way. Do you have advice that you would give to newer returning hams to the hobby?
Who are newly returning to the hobby?
I give myself as an example. I had a radio in the car that I would turn on as I'm driving to and from work. I was mostly inactive for almost 25 years, raising my family and the children and stuff, getting my career together. So when I came back to amateur radio in the probably about 2008 or so, everything had changed. I felt like Rip Van Winkle waking up to see that amateur radio world had changed with the proliferation of technology. So what was missing for me was advice from people like you that said, Eric, now that you're back, this is the stuff that you should look at. So do you have advice that you might give to new hams or hams that are coming back after a prolonged absence?
Well, this is very interesting, Eric, because there are many hams that do the same thing you did. In their younger years, they're in ham radio, and they set it aside because of the demands of career, family, and whatever. And then later on, when they are in a more relaxed point in their life, they get back in ham radio. So I would say they could go back doing the same sort of activities that they used to do, and they will still be able to do it and have fun doing it and find other hams that are doing it. But then they should start reading about what the modern trend is and what they might want to do in the way of some of these modern modes of communication.
Well, I think that's great advice. Al, thank you so much for joining me. Earlier in the week, I must tell you that Al and I had a schedule on Zoom. The fact was I had forgotten the reason that I'd actually invited Al. It was for something completely different in my mind, but Al reminded me that we were going to have a QSO Today conversation, and I'm so glad, Al, that you insisted and that you came back and that we had this conversation today. It was such a real pleasure. With that, I want to thank you so much and wish you 73.
Well, it was a lot of fun talking with you. I appreciate what you're doing, and I have looked at several of your podcasts, and I'll be looking at more as time permits. So I wish you 73. Good luck to your grandchildren. I, at this point, have 3 great-grandchildren, and it's nice to see them growing up and catch their interest in these old things. Good day to you. Shalom, and thank you for a very wonderful conversation.
That concludes this episode of QSO Today. I hope that you enjoyed this QSO with Al. Please be sure to check out the show notes that include links and information about the topics that we discussed. Go to www.qsotoday.com and put in W1AB in the search box at the top of the page. I mentioned at the beginning of the show that we now have prizes that can be won by your participation in the QSO Today Virtual Ham Expo. One of the first places to get points is by your early registration before July 24th. If you have not yet registered for your free ticket to the expo, be sure to register now or before the July 24th early bird deadline. If you have already registered, then you already have those points if you opted in to be contacted by the sponsors and exhibitors after the show. You see, this expo is paid for by the sponsors and exhibitors. That is why tickets are free. Please opt in when you register to show your support of all of us who are making this expo possible. My thanks to both ICOM America and QRP Labs for their support of the QSO Today podcast. Please show your support of these fine sponsors by clicking on their links in the show notes pages or by using QSO Today in the coupon box at checkout. You may notice that some of the episodes are transcribed into written text. If you'd like to sponsor any of these episodes into written text, please push the button in the middle of the show notes page. Support the QSO Today podcast by first joining the QSO Today email list by pressing the subscribe buttons on the show notes pages. I will not spam you or share your email address with anyone. Please become a listener sponsor monthly or annually by clicking on the sponsor buttons on the show notes page. I am grateful for any way that you show appreciation and support. It makes a big difference. QSO Today is now available on a host of platforms including Spotify, TuneIn, iHeartRadio, and the iTunes Store. A list of these services is on the right side of the show notes pages. Stitcher is still my favorite. My thanks to my friend and colleague Ben Bresky, who makes every QSO Today interview guest and this host sound brilliant. Thanks, Ben. Until next time, this is Eric for Z1UG 73. The QSO Today podcast is a product of KEG Media Inc., who is solely responsible for its content.